Okay. The questions, I say, if you put them into the comments, and feel free to make comments as we go along, but we will be monitoring the comments. And I have to point out that if there's any inappropriate comments, inappropriate behaviour, and I don't need to detail exactly about that. Obviously, racist, sexist comments will be it won't be deleted. You'll be ejected from the meeting, and that's the same with any insulting or personal or ad hominem attacks on any of the councillors who have gone out their way to be with us tonight. So let's keep this respectful. We're here to hear from the candidates, from the parties, from their point of view, what's been going on and what they will do if elected. That's the point of our Hustings. We're not here to have a shouting match or to criticise individuals. We're here to get answers and to listen to what the councillors have to say. So be respectful. And if you're not, we have Fatima waiting in the wings, and she won't be long bouncing you straight out of the Zoom. So we're going to start with, I think I'll do this in alphabetical order, if I can just work out my alphabet. So yeah. So we'll do it in alphabetical order of the councillors rather than the party, just as a way of doing it. So so we're going to ask Robert Connoly, who's representing the Scottish Conservatives tonight, to give us an opening statement on behalf of his party. Robert, if that's okay.
Yep. Thank you for having me. Just to introduce myself, I'm Robert Connoly, councillor with the Conservative group on the council, and I represent the Calton ward. So I am the group's, the Conservative group spokesperson on Glasgow Life as well. So pretty much everything that comes up at this Hustings is stuff that I've been working on, trying to do stuff on for a good 5 years now. So my local, I've seen that someone's saying they can't hear me. Is that an issue?
It's slightly quiet, but it's okay. Maybe just, I don't know if there's a volume thing, or if you could just maybe get closer
Try
to
to speak up a bit more, or get closer, because unfortunately I am on mobile for this. So in terms of local support, I've been trying to support the Glasgow Life facilities in my ward, for instance, the People's Palace Winter Gardens. So we've been working to try to get funding, been working with the campaign groups as well as the People's Palace Winter Gardens and Glasgow Green kind of parks group, and trying to get show my support and give my support anywhere I can to support that beautiful building along with the museum, along with trying to restore the winter gardens. Also, I was helping the campaign, which was to save Whitehill Pool a few years back as well. That campaign was successful to save that pool, and I believe it was Hag Hill Glasgow Cub facility as well at the time. Myself, I've also been calling for bids to the UK government Levelling Up Fund, because I feel like that fund can really help get the restorations in place for places like the People's Palace Winter Gardens, which I specifically had lobbied the officers in the council to prepare a bid for that, which actually did happen, which is good. So we'll hopefully see something coming from that. No news as of yet. And going forward, if we get more Conservative councillors elected and if I'm re-elected, we're really hoping to use our influence to get more funding from the UK government to help our cultural assets in Glasgow and other Glasgow Life facilities, such as when our group leader Thomas Kerr was asked by Glasgow Life to actually speak to the UK government ministers to try and get extra support for the borough collection. And we're hoping to do that with other things in Glasgow as well. Also wanted to discuss some of the things my Conservative councillors had done for the Save Our Libraries campaign. So we had myself going across to quite a few of the libraries that were part of the campaign, including White Inch, which I believe Billy Avenue, or Councillor Avenue, who is Victoria Ward councillor for the Conservatives, was very supportive of that. And Councillor Ewan Blockley over at the Cooper Institute was very supportive of the campaign over there to save the Cooper. So yeah, I'd say that we have been trying to be as supportive and helpful as possible with the campaigns that have been being run. But the truth is, all of this wouldn't be needed if Glasgow would just get a fair funding settlement from Holyrood and the SNP government. Now, it's very disappointing that the SNP haven't turned up today, because I would have liked to have heard from them on what they want to do about getting a fair funding settlement for Glasgow, so that we can fully fund our our Glasgow Life facilities, as well as other council services, but unfortunately they're not here. But we definitely need to make it very clear that Glasgow needs more money, and the council needs more money from the centralising SNP Holyrood government, or else this will just unfortunately continue until we're able to have the money to save all the venues, which is the aim of the Conservative group. Why we backed the motion, I think it was last year, that basically said that we back whenever it is possible to reopen all Glasgow Life facilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Connoly. We now move on to where are we? Councillor Malcolm Cunning, who's the leader of Scottish Labour's group at Glasgow City Council.
Thank you very much, Jim. And I'm almost going to do the reverse of Robert, because I'm going to start with perhaps the financial context within which Glasgow Life, as with everything else within Glasgow City, has to operate. And clearly we have a context in which Glasgow City Council, the starting point for comparisons is usually used as 2013, 2014, because that was the year in which police and fire was removed from all local authorities, and therefore the amounts can be more easily compared. And in that period, somewhere in the region of £350 million has been removed from Glasgow City Council. And inevitably, because of the restrictions on what we are and are not allowed to spend our money on, there's been more and more ring fencing of fundings coming through in the annual settlement from the Scottish Government to Scottish local authorities. The majority of cuts has inevitably fallen on those areas which are the subject of current continuous discussion in the press, and certainly as I've experienced over the past couple of months on the doors in Glasgow, and that's the state of our city cleansing, the state of our parks, the state of our roads, the state of our pavements, and the state of Glasgow Life and the cultural, sporting and social facilities which Glasgow Life provides to our citizens. In the run-up to the pandemic, because I think we need to emphasise that the pandemic has brought many of the deep-seated issues around Glasgow Life to a head, but they are not the cause in its entirety of the problems that Glasgow Life face at the moment. In the past several years, the amount of money that has been paid across by Glasgow City Council to Glasgow Life as there is your core funding for you to run that entire range of services has effectively only covered the cost of wages, with a few £1 million above that. All the rest of the monies that Glasgow Life requires in order to run that entire range of services, from high-end, high-art museums, etc., the concert hall, to football pitches like Barlia in my ward, or community centres in Castlemilk and the like. Much of that money has had to be either self-generated or raised from other sources. And that's where the pandemic has caused very particular problems. As a city, Glasgow has traditionally spent more of its money on the wide range of cultural and leisure services per capita than any other city in Scotland. We spend more in Glasgow, or have traditionally spent more in Glasgow, than is spent, for example, in Edinburgh. And that partly is as a result of the fact that Glasgow does have a range of museums and cultural facilities, which in the likes of Edinburgh are often categorised as national museums or national facilities, and therefore are funded directly by the Scottish Government and run through long-standing trusts that have often existed for generations, whereas here in Glasgow we run them ourselves. And the creation of Glasgow Life, as has happened in a number of local authorities up and down the length of the UK, was an attempt to find a way to make that range of services and facilities more sustainable within an environment of diminishing or restricted income. That has become more and more difficult. And we have, during the pandemic, reached a crisis point where things that may have not have happened for several years down the line have suddenly come to fruition. And that has led to an utterly unacceptable situation where a large range of our services and facilities are still closed. We are absolutely committed and tried to move in our budget amendments this year, and will move again if we become the administration after May the 5th, for the immediate reopening as soon as possible of every single community centre across the city. We will find ways of guaranteeing the future of all the libraries, which at the moment there is only funding for 1 year definitely in place, and that we will give that as a guarantee and a priority for an incoming Labour administration. While we do support and have always supported the possibility of community transfer of certain services and facilities, that must only be done in situations where there is A, capacity, and B, clear demand for that to happen. What is projected at the moment as community empowerment is far too often simply an excuse of finding a way to dump services and facilities, which the council and or Glasgow Life are saying at the moment we cannot afford to run, on hard-pressed communities with no clear ability within the community and no clear funding in order for them to run it themselves. It may survive in some instances for a year or two, but the worry is that 2 or 3 years down the line that simply collapses and the blame is placed on the community rather than in Glasgow City Council. And though, as I say, we would not rule out instances of asset transfer where there is proven ability to make that work, it is something that has to be done sparingly and carefully, and not as a way of simply dumping services onto the community that Glasgow City Council or Glasgow Life claims it no longer has the capacity to run. The other thing that we are committed to, and I know has been one of the campaign aims of Glasgow against closure, the other thing that we are committed to is to have a root and branch examination of the structures of Glasgow Life itself. I absolutely appreciate why many people have an ambition to bring Glasgow Life back in. But in order to achieve that, then what we need to do is to address the very significant loss of income or increased costs to Glasgow Life or to cultural and leisure services as a result of the loss of various tax benefits, particularly around non-domestic rates and VAT on commercial activity within cultural and leisure services. And unless and until we can address that, then simply committing to bring back in is something which at this stage that myself and the Labour group would not be prepared to do. But we are prepared to enter into discussions with staff, with trade unions, with service users, etc., the wider community of Glasgow, as to what is the best way forward to maintain both the democratic accountability of the service and the financial viability. And I see you coming up, Jim, which I presume suggests I've exhausted my 5 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Thank you for that, Councillor Cunning. Yeah, you exhausted a bit more than 5 minutes. Yeah, those questions, you will get a chance to talk about those subjects as we go along. Next is John Molyneux, who's the co-leader of the Scottish Green Party's group at Glasgow City Council. John.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks everyone for inviting me and coming along this evening. To put it in context, the Greens, so our manifesto, our pitch for these elections is going to put climate emergency front and centre and say that has to be the city's priority. It's an existential crisis that humanity faces, but actually the issues around community assets and the work that Glasgow Against Closures have been doing is central to that discussion as well, because we know that the climate change isn't fair. We know that the richest do the most damage, but the impacts are felt by those with the least, and that's a pattern that we see around the world. But it's a pattern that we see here in Glasgow as well. People with the least means to cope with rising energy and food bills, communities most affected by flooding, people most excluded because of public transport. So we know that as well as a fast transition to net zero, we also need to make it fair. And I do think community assets have a big part to play in that. There's a lot of interest now in the idea of the 20-minute neighbourhood, the idea that we should be able to do more and live our lives better locally. It's something that we've advocated for a long time. The pandemic has accelerated that, a greater interest in localising of services and people spending time closer to home, reducing the need for travel, etc. So actually having really good, high quality, accessible, inclusive community facilities that meet people's changing needs, not accepting that everything is that what we have right now is what people are going to have in perpetuity, but having a really good level of engagement at a local level, so we make sure we get the facilities and the services at a local level that people really need. And that's also for me about there's something there about a well-being economy. Again, Green's very clear that our economy, or our measure of progress, should not just be about growth. In fact, it shouldn't be about growth, not in terms of growth as in the output of people's paid labour. It needs to be looking at our collective well-being as a society. And I think libraries and community facilities are absolutely the backbone of that. One of the comments that was made to me very early on when I was involved in the campaign at Pollock Shields Library, the very first Save the Library campaigns were the Pollock Shields, Langside and Govan Hill, and I was heavily involved in the Pollock Shields one, which is my ward. Was the idea that a library was somewhere where you could, pretty much the only place, to be fair, you could spend time without spending money. So we have to recognise the value in the real fundamental value in things which aren't just predicated on economic growth. So that, in that context, we see community assets as absolutely central to the vision that we want to create for Glasgow. I will address the funding issue. Absolutely, we do need to have greater levels of investment in the city. I don't think there's any dispute on that. We need to look seriously about the reform of local finance. It's not adequate, the funding we get from Scottish Government, but fundamentally it's not fair, the way in which that funding is allocated and the way in which we as a city have relatively little, particularly compared to any other European country and European municipalities, such a tiny fraction of our own power to generate income is held locally. We're massively dependent on those central government grants. So we do need that change. We've pushed for the council tax reform for a long time. There is going to be progress on that in this Parliament, but it needs to happen, and it needs to happen, in my view, in a way that delivers radical change to actually fund our services. I'm going to touch briefly. We'll expand on these points, obviously, in discussion. But we, as a group, support the three broad aims of the Glasgow Against Communities campaign. Throughout this, we've consistently advocated for communities not just to be heard, but to be listened to. And all the amendments and all the action that Greens have taken within the City Council, within the chambers, throughout this campaign have been in that spirit. And we've delivered on that. We've given up communities opportunities to be part of that discussion, not as well as it should have been. I think the way that some of those opportunities are handled was pretty shocking. But we've been consistently advocating for communities to be part of that discussion. And in terms of the three aims, getting venues open, as I say, I was at the library campaign early on. We delivered funding, the £1.2 million, which is in the funding, and I'll correct Malcolm on this, that funding is in the baseline. The funding to keep libraries open is baselined. It's not 1 year. There's another £3 million actually going in next year, returning the Glasgow Life service fee to what it was pre-pandemic. So there is money in the Glasgow Life budget. We put money in this year for reopening St Mungo's and Providence Lawnship. And a 1.2 million for community venues, not just the community centres. We've broadened that, so it could include the public halls as well. So we need to have we need to see what we can do with that investment to make sure we get the right allocation to the right facilities. We back the calls for improved accountability. I know you're up, Jim. I will be very brief on these points. We're absolutely improved accountability. Probably similar to Malcolm, I think we see there are opportunities where community ownership, not community ownership, community management can be advantageous, but that should not mean trading off with public and democratic accountability and scrutiny. And I think there are models we can look at, whether it's cooperative models. Organisations like the Galgale Trust, I think, has a really interesting structure in terms of how you maximise the democratic accountability, but bring it closer to communities. And finally, on Glasgow Life, we absolutely back reform. Greens opposed the creation of Glasgow Life from the very start, and we think it's really iniquitous that you have a model where we can't open a library unless we sell gig tickets at the concert hall. It just doesn't make any sense. So we do want to see services brought back in-house. We think we should start with the community estate, with libraries and community centres, and get those back in. That might take time. We want to consult on that. In the meantime, we can take action to reform the way that Glasgow Life is governed right now. We should have communities and workers on the board, not investment bankers and city grandees. So we are committed to furthering the aims of the campaign, and I really look forward to the discussion as we go on this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. If I remind end, if you have any questions, general questions or points to make, put them in the chat box, and Iona will sort them out, and we'll hear from you, either a collection of your questions or individual questions later. We're going to move quickly on to our first question because Colin can't be with us for that long. Colin McGeoch is one of the organisers of the Save White Inch Library campaign and the General Save Our Libraries campaign, and he's been an absolute stalwart of Glasgow Against Closures. So Colin will be asking the first question, which will be addressed to all three candidates.
Thanks, Jim. There is a lot of legitimate concern and fear that the People Make Glasgow's Communities Initiative has been used as a vehicle to offload a significant number of the cultural and heritage buildings without community consultation with even local elected members, and more importantly, local communities. So my question is in two parts. What guarantees does your party have that going forward community groups will be consulted regarding what they need in the local area? And indeed, how will you do the consultation? And what guarantees can you give that there will be a plan and resources made available to fund the management of Glasgow's heritage buildings, including the reopening of the closed Glasgow Life venues, such as the 26 community centres and halls? So the questions are, what guarantees and how we do it for community consultation, and what guarantees that a plan will be made, because there is no plan to manage the culture and heritage buildings, and how will you make resources available to fund the management of these buildings? and reopen the Glasgow Life venues.
Thanks, Colin. It's an important part of the funding of it. Some of these groups that are taking over the management or lease of buildings and assets, we know don't have any money, and it's based on the fact that it might possibly get funded in the future. So I'm going to shuffle about the order this one. So to come back to Colin, I'll ask Councillor Cunning to reply first.
I'm having trouble putting my video on. I think that's what's now. The issue around how you consult with the wider community in terms of asset transfer, it is an important one. I was having discussions that one of the things that came up, not in my own ward, but one of the things that came up in the City Administration Committee of the tranche of services and facilities that were up for potential negotiation for asset transfer about 3 weeks ago now, was, for example, Caskin Park, which is not in my ward, but is just outside my ward. And it is fair to say that in the run-up to that decision, there was an awful lot of complaint from the community, including the Community Council and a number of other very active groups, either in Govan Hill or in Mount Florida, both of which communities make use of and see that area as part of their community, felt that they had not been involved. I think there were a few groups had indicated interest in taking that over, and there was an awful lot of questions about just who these groups were, what was the background of these groups, who did these groups really represent, who were these groups accountable to, and it's these sorts of issues that we need to address in any consultation process, so that not only is the process itself of transfer or potential transfer to community organisations clear, but what is the background, the makeup, the structure, and the accountability, as John to some extent referred to in his introductory remarks, of those organisations. And we need to really work at getting a structure to do that, which is open and lasts for a period of time and has all the information in front of it. And we need to do that through community councils, through area committees. The Labour group is also looking at a wider issue of community panels, bringing people together, representing the third sector community organisations more widely within each single ward, which issues like this and various other issues facing the council can all be run by. In terms of reopening, we still go back to fundamental financial issues as to what can and cannot be done, but we have certainly costed it for the last budget that we'd be committed to immediately reopening the 15 community centres.
Thank you, Councillor Cunning. Councillor Molyneux.
Yeah, thanks, Jim, and thanks, Colin, for the question. I'll probably touch on some of the very similar points that Malcolm's just made. So I agree, People Make Glasgow Communities has caused alarm. It's created this sense of a fire sale. The officers will argue this isn't anything new, that they've always, that the powers around community asset transfer have existed, that they're actually looking at doing things in a more flexible way. But I think the scale and pace of what's happening is definitely worrying. And the point about it was the Contracts and Property Committee had the first tranche, if you like, of proposals that had come through last couple of weeks ago. I think there were 5 proposals that were brought forward. I was the only member of that committee really that spoke actively, not necessarily against proposals, but in favour of a much more accountable model for doing it. And Greens in our manifesto will commit to pausing the current process of People Make Glasgow Communities, so we can make sure we come back with something that is genuinely rooted in community empowerment, that's not confusing that with with a mass transfer out of public accountability. So the amendment that I moved in that meeting on all of the proposals that came forward was about doing three things. It was asking officers to say, you know, to make sure that we're developing and delivering models for these that maximize public and democratic accountability, and those models do exist. There are models where we can enshrine real high standards, not a low bar. And I think there's a point here about democracy. There's a low bar and a high bar of democracy, and I know, and Fatima makes this point, and I know it well about, you know, actually, you know, you get to vote us out if we do a bad job. Now that you do, you know, the democratic process in terms of election is there, but in some ways that's the low bar, that's the fallback. The high bar for me in terms of democracy is in active participation. It's about communities and individuals being invested in and participating in things, and cooperatives, as I mentioned, is a really good example of how you can create models that really do that with workers, with communities at their heart. So it's looking at how can we bring those models in. It's about looking at how we have really close alignment with council policies and procedures. So you know, there are good policies, there are good things in the operation of Glasgow Life Services in terms of how we do inclusion, in terms of how we do accessibility. Those could potentially be at risk in transferring them to another organisation. So we need a mechanisms that lock that in, and we need mechanisms for recourse, because if the council's retaining ownership, we need a mechanism for recourse, that if a third party goes against those principles, that we've got those checks and balances. So that's the motion I moved, which was agreed to. I also opposed, and again was you know, moved the opposition to the Cathkin Park transfer in that meeting, because we didn't have any of those things. The motion was brought to agree that transfer without any of those additional protections brought in. Unfortunately, it didn't pass, and the SNP group voted to go with the transfer. The Labour group was actually split on that vote, which is fine, it's their right, but you know, we do need to nail this down, I think, in terms of where we're coming from. And yeah, so I think, and in terms of how we consult, so this is probably the point I was making about in some ways that should come through the models. We should have an interest in working with community organisations who, in their governance and how they operate, have that high level of democratic participation wedded and locked in. People Make Glasgow Communities is working potentially directly with private companies. I think that's completely wrong. I think we should be ruling private companies out of this altogether. We should only be prepared to work with groups that have the highest level of democratic participation. And yeah, and then finally, I guess your last point was about investment. I think specifically on heritage assets. There's decades of underinvestment in these buildings, and it's painful. We absolutely need the investment to tackle it. There's a whole load of issues around heritage protection. I think we need a heritage commission, and not just at the city council level. We need to involve all levels of government. We need our councillors, but we need our MSPs, we need our MPs, because there's a necessity for changes in planning and building control across lots of levels of government. VAT is a disincentive to renovating old buildings. There's lots of action that we need to get to seriously change what's happening with the neglect of Glasgow's heritage buildings, because it's really distressing, and that's what we would propose to do as a real high priority coming in after the next election, to get that commission set up and get proposals for reform that we can do pretty quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Molyneux, and next Councillor Connoly on Colin's question.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. In terms of the asset transfers, I think broad agreement in terms of it really needs to be groups and community groups that are already set up and ready to go, and are actually in the interest of the community if it is to happen. I think in some cases it could be beneficial, in some cases it may not, and that's why I think a review of how of the current system is certainly needed, and we would propose that in the next term of the council. And one of the main things about it, I would say, and it's part of the question as well. It's about the how it's community, how the facility that would be run, whether it be Glasgow Lifestyle or a different organisation, what the community wants is the important thing, and what the community needs is the important thing, and therefore that goes to the consultation, which I believe that consultations that the council have done aren't always the best. And so we really need to figure out a new way of doing proper consultation with the community. Because some areas, for instance, don't have an active community council. They might not have an active group that has ties in with the council, but there will be groups of people that are interested in what's going on in their community. And if we can get more people that know about these groups, we can really get in there. So I think the main thing for councillors to work on, in my view, is to get around their local areas, speak to people about the groups, speak to people about the issues that are actually taking place in terms of their cultural assets, their libraries, their community centres, and actually get people talking about it. Because although people will talk about it to us when we're knocking on a door, there might not be a group for the council to get into and actually do a proper consultation. Not that I'm making up any excuses for the quite at times lazy way that consultations have been done. I think we need to look at different forms of consultations, such as what was used for the money for certain wards, as well as green spaces in the past council term, where we have community panels. I think that worked relatively well, and that might be a way to look into it, because what that basically did was allowed people that were in the community to be on the panels, as well as it was a community vote. So it was people that lived in the area that actually made the decision of where the money was going, and I think that is a very good way to go around that. Finally, just in terms of the investment, obviously I touched on it earlier about funding from central government. That's definitely something, definitely part of the answer to this question. But I think all groups need to find a way of, if we don't get that improved funding settlement, we have to find a way of redirecting resources from other areas of the council which aren't necessarily needed, or maybe they're just not as useful, and put them into the opening of facilities. But the truth is, the best way to do that would be to have a better funding settlement, and that's what we would be fighting for.
Thank you, Councillor Connoly. I'm noticing that time's moving on here, so if the councillors could try and keep their answers to just 2 or 3 minutes for these questions, so that we can get questions for the kind of general thing later on. And anyone's here, remember to put your questions in the chat, and I'll be collating them so we can come back to them later. We're going to move on to question 2 now. That's from Angela Breverton. Angela is an activist for Unison. She's also a very important part of the Glasgow Against Closures campaign, and was a very a driving force of the successful Save Whitehill Pool campaign up in Denison.
Sorry, I forgot I was muted. I want to ask the councillors, I've got like a million questions, but I'll stick to this in terms of referencing from a Unison point of view. What I've heard is deeply disturbing. What I'm hearing from you, I find so disturbing. Where is the commitment to public services? Where is the commitment? Why are we talking about putting all this pressure on communities, on people who are already under pressure in their own lives? I'm appalled. I'm absolutely appalled. The commitment should be to publicly funded, publicly run, public services ran on our behalf. And of course, from the union point of view, that is keeping people in a job, people who are trained to work with communities to ascertain. You don't need to do a consultation. You have the staff in the buildings, reach community workers, remember them, who reach out to the communities and put on what the communities want in their centres. You don't need to spend a lot of money on consultations. You need to employ staff who are trained and they're trained in equalities, they're trained in working with disabled people, they're trained in GDPR, they're trained in working with the elderly, all these wonderful, wonderful things that community workers did when we employed them. And so I'm just astounded by what I'm hearing here. We need more money from central government, is our point of view. And my question is, what are you going to do to ensure that people that we still do have in community centres, although they tend to be, most of them are more in a janitorial type role, then actually we need more community workers is the bottom line. And that would save you a whole load of money on consultations for a start. But what reassurances can you give to the trade unions that you will keep these spaces open and that you will fund them properly? Because they're needed. I can't emphasize this enough, how much these spaces are needed right now during this pandemic. We're not out of it yet. And what I want to know your commitment to funding and staffing and resourcing these centres in a sustainable way for the future. What are your thoughts on that? How would you do it? Do you believe in that? Or do you really just want to carry on down this line of community asset transfers, which have been shown not to work in the past, because you get people with certain interests who want to run it and run it for their benefit, not trained staff. So if you could tell us what your commitment is, the three candidates, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. That is an important point. I mean, I've been involved in working in communities as a community activist for over 30 years. And one of the things that used to be a kind of staple part of it was in every community centre, we had community education workers at the centre of community and making sure, and that was a way that communities were listened to. So I'll sort of reshuffle the order again. So it'll be Councillor Molyneux to answer Angela's question first.
Thanks, Angela. Yeah, really, really good question. I'll try and pick up on points in turns. And investment-wise, I mean, absolutely, we need investment in those services at a local level, and that's why, when I said earlier we would pause People Make Glasgow Communities, we would pause that straight away if we're fortunate enough to form an administration after the elections. We would pause People Make Glasgow Communities. Now, there is a legal basis for community asset transfer. So, so there is that exists within legislation, and the council is bound to that. So we have to accept that those rights do exist in law, and we have to work with them. But we absolutely think the way that this is being handled at the moment, the way it's been pitched as a fire sale, effectively has created that alarm. It's created alarm in communities, and it's created alarm with workers for the jobs, and we think that's wrong. So we need to pause and rethink how we do it, and how we do support it. And like I say, our support for that is contingent on, it's not going to be for most services, and where it is the model, if those models do exist, they have to absolutely maximize democratic participation through their governance structures. And also, for me, the bit is really important. I think you picked up on equalities and training. in the public sector, and this is where I go back to the thing about democracy and high bar and low bar, and actually that kind of thing about active participation. Now, there are things that are requirements of the public sector that facilitate good democracy, in my view. That's things like freedom of information legislation, environmental information regulations, public sector equality duty, all these things. Some, when I raised these in the meeting, in the Contracts and Property meeting, the SNP convener described them as bureaucracy, but they're okay in the public sector. We respect them in the public sector because they are important. And actually, when we lose these things by transferring venues or facilities out, we have to make sure that we're doing what we can to lock those things. So I absolutely support those fundamentals about public accountability and the public interest. And in most cases, those will be best served by keeping facilities within and run by Glasgow City Council. We can't stop that in all circumstances because of the legal basis around community asset transfer. So we have to try and find models where we can do it better, I think, is the key thing for me. And absolutely that, the jobs thing goes hand in hand with that as well. So I hope that, gives you some reassurance that we would, I think, act in maintaining the public interest through this process and making sure that we're not rushing into things which fundamentally weaken our citizens' democratic rights and our citizens' democratic ability to hold people to account for what's going on in their local communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Molyneux. So, Councillor Connoly on Angela's question.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. And I think I did focus on what we would do for to improve the system at the time. But I would say, for me anyway, and from what the discussions I've had, the main thing is that if a facility is better off, which in quite a lot of cases it would be within Glasgow Life, then it should remain within Glasgow Life. I think what I was really making the point of earlier was how we would try to make sure that the community was engaged in any asset transfer requests for any buildings or to be used outside of Glasgow Life, and I think that was that's pretty essential as well. But yeah, no, I think what we need, and you've touched on it yourself in your the points that you made, the funding needs to come from somewhere, and that's what we need to be lobbying on to the Scottish Government, even to Westminster. One of the questions that was put into the chat earlier, especially with our national heritage that we've got in Glasgow, and more does need to be done on that, and that would certainly help. And like I said in my last question, I think redirection of resources as well to open up services if that's required. But overall, it's really about trying to, like I said on my opening statement, it's about opening up all the community centres and facilities as quickly as possible, and opening up to the same extent as they were before the pandemic, which means the aim would be no job losses. In general, it would be no job losses and to open up all facilities.
Thank you, Councillor Connoly. Councillor Cunning.
Thank you. Our manifesto is not yet published, but I can tell you that it is basically written. And of our 10 key pledges within the manifesto, one of those pledges will be to build a broad campaign for fair funding for Glasgow, because as I said in my opening remarks, this has to be seen in the context of somewhere north of 350 million having been robbed out of Glasgow City Council's budget over the past 10 years, and indeed over a longer period of time than that. in the first periods of the current SNP Scottish Government between 2007 and 2011, the first of the cuts started coming through, and those cuts and those budgets that enforced those cuts were supported by the Conservatives, who the SNP at that time depended on to get their budgets through. In the period of time since then, the SNP have enforced on the Glasgow City Council and indeed other local authorities cuts at around 3 to 4 times any level of cut to the Scottish Government, and that has been supported year in, year out by the Greens, who they have defended on, other than in the short period when they had a majority of their own, in order to get those budgets through. And we will be building, or attempting to build, a campaign with Civic Glasgow, with particularly the trade unions, and with all political parties who are willing to join us in so doing, in building the pressure on the Scottish Government that in order to protect the whole range of services, including cultural and leisure services, in order to protect the whole range of services provided by Glasgow City Council, we need to get to a stage where there is fair funding to protect those services and protect those jobs. One of the other things that Angela raised, and I mean, there's 3 examples spring to mind that all go to it, is in terms of the capacity of the council to fairly, properly and efficiently run services, compared with some of the experiences where those services have either started out in the community or been transferred back to the community. I think of, for example, Pollokshields Community Council, Community Centre. Pollokshields Community Centre started off as a voluntary service run by the community, and was taken over by the council because there were all sorts of issues around the funding and financing of it, and there were huge issues around whether it was genuinely serving the entirety of the community, or whether there were issues around certain cliques and groups within the community who'd effectively taken control of the service. And the only way to resolve some of the many issues that arose around that was for the council to step in. But Pollokshields Community Council is community centre is one of those that's now back, potentially as something that may be available for community asset transfer. St Mungo's Museum started out its life outside the council, effectively from a trust that grew out of the cathedral, and the council again had to step in because the capacity was not there to run the service and facility of the museum that the St Mungo's people originally tried to do. And the council had to take it over to run it efficiently, and now we're back at the stage of saying, let's perhaps hand it back to some external organisation. And I also look at, say, Barlia, which are the football pitches in my community. And I mean, Barlia was not operating efficiently before the pandemic. Regularly, matches were having to be cancelled because there were not the staff there in order to open the facility up, because the staff had been transferred down to Torry Glen, or there was only one member of staff on duty at the sports centre in Castlemilk, and therefore there was nobody able to open up the gates to let people onto the pitches. That has been transferred on a short-term contract at the moment, and it was not the ambition of the people involved there and the volunteers involved there to start running Barlia. But they're now running it, and the place is packed. It is, in the short term at least, a success, and there are far more people now playing on Barlia than there were even before the pandemic. So there's swings and roundabouts around it. But I think my personal experience of 20 years as a councillor and seeing some of the examples of things coming in and going out is that my prejudice on the whole would be, where we can keep it and run it, we should keep it and run it. but we should not rule out entirely the possibility, as I emphasised at the start, where there's the demand and the capacity, that there are instances where the community can run it better, but that should not be at the expense of the long-term life of the service, and it shouldn't be a cheap way of getting rid of jobs.
Thank you, Councillor Cunning. We're going to move on to the third of our main questions from Elspeth King. Sorry, Angela, we don't have time to come back in now.
I just wanted to say that I wanted the unions will be very interested to meet with any other parties to discuss.
Sorry. Right. So our next question comes from Elspeth King, which is on the theme of Glasgow Life. Many of you know Elspeth. She's an author and historian and former curator at the People's Palace for nearly 2 decades. And I'd like to point out just a wee fact here that when Elspeth was curator at the People's Palace, it was European Museum of the Year in 1981. It was British Museum of the Year in 1983, and now it's shut. So Elspeth. Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, aye. Right, on Glasgow Life, I think there's a great opportunity here to look at the question of letting Glasgow Life die quietly and bringing the operation in-house again, because you've got the retirement of the CEO, and Glasgow Life has lasted the working life of that CEO, and she has shaped that. We as a voluntary community have found it really, really hard to get any interaction with Glasgow Life as volunteers. We know it's an arm's length organisation which was meant to be able to fundraise and function better on account of its separation from the council, but we've found on the contrary, it's us, the public, who are being kept at arm's length, and neither the ALIO nor the elected members will answer our questions, each passing us to the other. We've been trying to get, for example, a costing on the repair of the winter gardens for 3 years and 3 months, and we don't have it yet. We've been very disappointed in the performance of Glasgow Life. We think it's structurally unsound, and the very words are now a contradiction in terms, because with the death announcement of all the facilities which make life in Glasgow worth living, which came post-COVID, Glasgow Life has really failed our communities spectacularly. And just even maintaining a conversation with these folk has been a trial. And we're not seeking to come in and do jobs or take away jobs. We were seeking to supplement what is already there and give a bit of help, and we haven't been able to do that. And our simplest offers of help have been rebuffed. We've been treated as the enemy. We've been told to go away, and we've been told not now, and we just can't get answers. And I think the way Glasgow Life is operating really has to be revised, resolved, and restructured. So my basic question is, how will you councillors and your party deal with these problems that Glasgow Life has thrown up, and will you look at reform?
Thanks, Elspeth. So we're back to the first, what was it again, the first order? So it's Councillor Connoly to come in first to answer Elspeth's question, re Glasgow Life.
Thank you, Elspeth, and I just want to catch up on firstly the point about the winter gardens. It has been shocking how that has been dealt with, and yes, we still don't have a costing for it. As you know, I'm very supportive of your campaign and the two groups that you're part of that are looking at the saving the winter gardens, as well as everything else around Glasgow Green. So definitely hope to continue talking with you on those things and getting better actions. But I think the main point really is in terms of bringing Glasgow Life in-house. Is that we would love to speak with the Glasgow Accounts Closures team on this, because there's in the points that were sent to us a few months back, there was in the email response we sent back, there was mostly we could agree with. The one point really was on the bringing Glasgow Life in-house, due to mainly financial reasons, as has been discussed already. So at the moment, we wouldn't be in a position to say to bring Glasgow Life in-house, but we certainly would be in a position to say that we need to look at how it's run and see what we can do to change and improve the service delivery from Glasgow Life, and that will very much need some sort of reform, which we will do our best to look into. To be fair, I'm pretty sure that all the other candidates tonight will probably say the same thing about reform needed. At least I know that John Molyneux has mentioned that they would actually be in support of bringing it back in-house. But yeah, I think that's what we will be able to commit to is seeing what we can do to reform, and be in agreement that it is definitely not up to scratch, especially with public relations.
Thanks, Councillor Connoly. So, Councillor Cunning.
Thank you. There is currently a review of Glasgow Life being carried out, though I would have some concerns that it's a review that I'm not sure who has got the inputs to, who is doing the reviewing, who's been consulted during the review. All I know, I met with a senior council officer, not within Glasgow Life, but with a senior council officer earlier today, and was asking when are we going to get the results of that review, and I understand that that will be in August. Now, how extensive that review is, I am entirely unclear, and that is perhaps part of the problem of it. But depending on what comes out of that review, and what might or might not be recommended of that review, that is, I think, perhaps the opportunity to say either that the review process has been entirely unsatisfactory and we need to open it out and use it as a starting point, or to perhaps, if it is worth the paper it's written on, use it as a way of beginning to engage more widely. Clearly, I mean, I have been a councillor for a period of time that includes when it was still cultural and leisure services within the council, and was a councillor and voted for the transfer of all of those services to Glasgow Life for reasons that I think I described earlier on. There has always then been a pressure as to what level of council control then is there of the services that are delivered, because attempts to keep Glasgow Life too close to the council then has brought the organisation sometimes into, shall we say, difficult discussions with the charity regulator, because the charity regulator has said that Glasgow Life is perhaps not truly independent of the council and a real charity, which is why the pressure has been on for increasing levels of external representation on the board, and clearer examples of independence. Now, I want to find a way whereby we maximise the income to Glasgow Life, and make sure that that income is spent as efficiently as possible on as wide a range of services as possible. But I want to do that where it's democratically accountable. And, you know, it's squaring that circle is a huge difficulty. of finding a way to maintain some of these tax advantages if they can. And if we can't maintain these tax advantages, then how do we backfill that loss of income? And what precisely is the loss of income? I've heard estimates between 30 and 50 million pounds per year is the potential loss of income of bringing it back in-house, which is clearly concerning. So there are huge questions about the democratic accountability of Glasgow Life and how the council, other than through, and Elspeth will understand this, having been involved personally, other than through service level agreements, etc., how does the council actually maintain control of the level of service that is provided, the type of service that is provided, and the way in which the service is provided? Because that is what I think we expect and the community expect, and particularly the community expects around area facilities and services that they dearly love, which includes the People's Palace. People always go on about how much Kelvin Grove is loved and how much it was part of certain people's Sunday afternoon, but exactly the same is true of the People's Palace and the Winter Gardens. There is a huge affection in the city for that facility, and we have to find ways to protect that and every other single facility in the city.
Thank you, Councillor Cunning. And finally, Councillor Molyneux on Elspeth's question with Glasgow Life.
Yeah, thanks, Elspeth. And yeah, I'm sorry that it's so dispiriting for you in the fight for People's Palace and Winter Gardens. Yeah, and I hope there's resolution on that soon. Obviously, there is some funding ring-fenced now in the council's budget for the council's contribution to a levelling up bid, and I hope that does proceed quite soon. I guess, so on your substantive points, absolutely, we're very concerned about the makeup of Glasgow Life and the way it's being run. I mentioned before my time on the council, but Green councillors did oppose the creation of Glasgow Life back in 2007 for many reasons, and I think they've been borne out in what's happened. I know there's a comment in the chat about that, you know, we were told that Glasgow Life was about bringing in additional funding. It's not actually been very successful in that, out with big capital projects like the borough and all that sort of stuff in terms of actually getting funding for services. It's not been very successful, and that's not a surprise because by and large it's delivering statutory services that should be paid for through taxation. So grant funders aren't going to generally put their hand in the pocket for services that fundamentally are statutory provisions. So, you know, I don't think we should have been surprised that that thing that was sold to people that Glasgow Life would do hasn't ultimately materialised. And the point is on the tax advantage, you know, so yes, I mean, they are important. So the decision to bring Glasgow Life back in-house would have a price tag. I've heard a figure of 20 million for everything, which is maybe a bit lower than Councillor Cunning, so there might be a meeting there. But you know, so the point of those things, the tax advantages are mainly non-domestic rates and VAT. Now, one of the things, so what we want to do as a first step is bring in the community estate, so libraries and community centres. So this whole idea that to open a library, to open a community centre, you can only do that if your sports facilities or your cultural facilities are selling tickets or selling memberships. That's wrong. So we need to protect the things, the community centres and libraries that shouldn't ever be expected to generate income to wash their face. They're protected. We believe that can be done for £4 million because, and actually, so there isn't a VAT impact on the community estate, or certainly not at the scale that there would be on the more commercial facilities. So it is just non-domestic rates now. And in an actual fact, where this is really perverse in my mind is that, you know, the only reason the council is having to pay non-domestic rates, or would have to pay non-domestic rates on these assets, which are public assets, and we're having to pay a local tax, which in turn comes back to us. And it's this perverse commodification of everything that has led to those things being included. And actually, I know this is getting kind of detailed, but the Barclay review of non-domestic rates, it went even further in the other direction, saying that actually, they're going to put protection on those, get rid of the protection, so you would become liable for non-domestic rates if they're brought back in. So I think there's something fundamentally wrong in that provision. We think non-domestic rates should be a local tax, that the city council should have full control of setting rates, and we should be able to exempt our own public assets from requiring payment of non-domestic rates, which would basically alleviate any shortfall on bringing back the community state into council control. And I will briefly say that, as I said, we want to do that. We want to consult on that. That will take time. It'd be interesting to see the outcome of the review, but we still expect that would take time, even if we get to do it. But there are things we could do right away. We can influence the change to the board of Glasgow Life. Now, the Greens and the Conservatives don't currently have any elected members on the board. They're held, I think there's 4 SNP members and 1 Labour member who sit on the board of Glasgow Life. So there's an opportunity to look at that to get the board really changed. I think, like I said, the idea that we have investment bankers and city grandees, we don't have workers, we don't have communities actually having a say at that level. We've had a situation, I believe, where there were special delegations in place. Now, lots of companies put in special delegations through the pandemic because decisions need to be made in a different way. Most of them lasted for 4 months for the first lockdown. In Glasgow Life, those delegations to the chair and chief executive existed for, I believe, around 18 months. So there was I was really concerned about a genuine lack of governance and scrutiny throughout all of that period. And as I say, locked out of board meetings to actually influence those decisions. So I think there are immediate things we can do to improve the governance of Glasgow Life, whilst we look at sorting out the opportunity to bring some services at least back in-house.
Hi everyone. I think I'll just try. I think Jim's having problems getting back into the video here. He's come back. Okay, I'll just pass you back on to Jim.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there. It was the internet connection at a well-known Southside Glasgow Charities office that are letting me use the place tonight. Sorry, I missed the end there of the replies to Elspeth. I thank councillors for the replies to our main questions. I noticed that we are running out of time quite quickly. I had promised people we would be done by 7:30, so we don't really have much time left. I'd like to make a couple of points on just what was discussed here about charities. People often talk about charities, and especially in asset transfers and things, that it's okay because something's a charity, or a charity is successful because it's got lots of people using it. And I'd just like to point out a very highly successful charity in the South Side that is very busy and very well used is Hutchison Grammar School, but no one would consider that as anything else but a private enterprise. So just something being a charity doesn't mean that it's community run. I'd just like to say the questions, we've got a load of questions coming in and we don't really have much time left. So Iona has very kindly sort of tried to mash them, composite them all into one question, which she's about to ask of the councillors. And we'll probably finish about there. But to point out to people that if you don't turn up to come already, we meet at this same Zoom link at the same time every week. I've been doing so for over a year now. There's sometimes 10 of us or sometimes 50 of us. We get together, all the various campaigns around Glasgow, to discuss issues and organise together. And the next thing we've organised together is a gathering on the 23rd of April down at the gardens next to the People's Palace, where the Save Our Venues campaign will be coming together again with some speakers, some music, some entertainment, and I hope everyone can join us. That'll be about 10 days before the election. You can come and make your voice heard. If you don't think the council's listening to you, we certainly are. So the final question, which is a sort of composite question of the questions you put in, will be asked by our very own Iona.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, like we said, lots to wade through, but hopefully this sums up, some of the feeling that's been here tonight. So my question is, under past and current administrations, and right the way throughout during our campaign, we've seen cuts to public services, we've seen a lack of democratic accountability over Glasgow Life and other ALIOs, and we've seen the prioritisation of profit-making services over services for the public good, like our community centres and libraries. So the question is simply, do you support this direction of policy? Can you acknowledge the damage that it's caused to the city and the people that live here? And what steps will your party take to turn the city around? Cheers.
Thanks, Iona. So at this time around, it's Councillor Cunning to answer first.
Thank you, Jim, and utterly concur your point about certain charities. It is bizarre that for years and years and years, Hutchinson Grammar did not pay non-domestic rates because it was charity, but Shawlands Academy did have to pay non-domestic rates because it wasn't a charity, it just educated local kids, which is farcical. I think we need to do both, Iona. I think we need to make sure we maintain what might be seen as the sort of high-end cultural assets, because they are the jewel in the crown of Glasgow, and they are loved and cherished by the citizens, and that includes places like the Borough, and that includes places like Kelvin Grove, and hopefully once it's up and open and running again, the People's Palace. But it also absolutely essentially includes our community centres. I had a phone call from a constituent not all that long ago, or actually it's about a year ago now, in terms of one community centre that was not open, and that was the community centre which hosted the meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, which my constituent was entirely dependent upon in terms of their mental health and their own journey in staying off of alcohol and combating their own addiction. Community centres are absolutely essential, whether that's Rockhill Community Centre, which is closed, or Castlemilk Community Centre in my own ward, which is now partially reopened, but not fully reopened, because they support a whole range of services for all sorts of groups in the community. And what we need to find is a way of doing is supporting all of those services and ensuring the future of all of those services. And it should not be a competition between them. And that when we say we're going to run Glasgow Life, whatever structure Glasgow Life may have in the future, it is the entire range of their services and facilities, whether that's sporting, cultural, theatre, museums, etc., etc. And yes, we need to have an offer around sports clubs, etc., where there may be some commercial elements, but that commercial element should be one that is genuinely contributing to the running of other services, and where possible underwriting the costs of some other services. But we should not be prioritising them simply that they survive and the absolutely essential community services do not survive.
Thank you, Councillor Cunning. Councillor Molyneux.
Yeah, thanks, Jim, and thanks, Iona. It's a really good question. Probably very, very similar to Malcolm. I agree. We have to do both things. You know, in terms of specifically what we would do, things that we're going to pledge in our manifesto. It is about, you know, talked about the importance of these of our community assets to well-being, and our vision. Our economic vision is about well-being. It's not about growth. It fundamentally has to be about recognizing value in things that GDP and all that sort of stuff doesn't value. So we've got to move away from that. We will commit to keeping our museums free. We will commit to guarantee funding for libraries for the duration of the council term. And we'll commit that there will be no changes to core library services without full local consultation. We want to harness, I guess, the energy of the local library campaigns. And I mentioned earlier, I was in the first wave of Save Glasgow Library campaigns in the readings at Pollock Shields. And then following that, I was at my local library along with Councillor Cunning as the local representative outside the Cooper. So I did about 18 months back to back of library campaigning. We want to harness the energy of those campaigns and have a real good discussion about the future of libraries. We have a motion, a Green Party motion that's being debated at the full council meeting on Thursday, which is touching on that. It's looking at whether our opportunities to genuinely creating a sharing economy, but a genuine sharing economy, not the massively corporatized version of Airbnb and that sort of stuff. But look, we've got tool sharing services, we've got bike sharing services, we've got toy sharing libraries, all these things. There's an opportunity, I think, to bring that local climate action into our libraries and genuinely, create hubs for sharing, for community action, all those sorts of things. And yeah, I think we want to put library users or community centre users at the heart of decision making. I've talked about the reforms we can do to Glasgow Life in terms of its governance, but right on a local level, we should have user forums that are actually influencing the decisions that are made on a local level. So I think there's a lot we can do to protect those local venues, to keep them free, to keep them inclusive, to keep them accessible to all the community, and give them a longer term future. That's not just, the funding is really important to that, but it's also about giving them a real purpose and really embedding them in communities and delivering services that people want. So we've got to have that conversation with people as well, to make sure that we've reopened the buildings. And I will briefly touch on, I know there's a comment asked in the budget about have Greens supported SNP budgets. Well, we have voted with the SNP budgets in the City Council a number of times this council, not all of them. No, so we haven't always, and where we have done that because we've been able to secure improvements. So that we reversed £4.7 million worth of cuts to Glasgow Life. That's the money that is in the baseline that's keeping libraries open, not just 1 year funding. That's going to keep libraries open. We put £1.2 million into community venues. In this budget, we put the money in for reopening St Mungo's and Province Lordship, and we've got the capital allocation for People's Palace. So where we have supported those, it's because we've been able to deliver on this agenda, as well as others, all the climate action things that we want to do in other areas. But where we've been able to protect and enhance local venues, that has been something we have pressed for consistently. So, thank you.
Oh, my unmute button wasn't working here. So thanks, Councillor Molyneux, and finally, Councillor Connoly.
Yes, thank you. So thank you for the question as well, Iona. And basically, what it's similar to what has been what was kicked off the other speakers, and that I think both are fundamentally important. But yeah, I don't think one should be prioritised over, particularly funding ones shouldn't be made a priority. Community facilities are obviously the bedrock of all our communities, and therefore they should take precedent. And obviously, that whilst in Glasgow Life, some of the funding really needs to come from like sports and museums and that. So what I would say is they are all as important. So you got the People's Palace Winter Gardens needs fully reopened, but so does the facilities that were fought for years ago, like White Hill Pool. I know people are here from that campaign. So I think we need to really look at the best way forward. And one of the ways forward, which was mentioned in a question that obviously we didn't get to, was funding for national museums in Glasgow. We completely support that, because not just because it'll obviously mean we aren't paying to maintain those museums, and that will come from central government, but also because that is really what it should be, because Edinburgh gets that help and Glasgow should get that as well, because our assets are just as important as Edinburgh's. and that would, as a side effect, also leave more money for us to spend on our community facilities. So that's one of the ways that we can really prioritise community facilities such as libraries, pools, whatever else. Fundamentally, one of the issues that comes up in some areas is the use of these places, such as the Emirates Arena, Tollcross swimming, should be focused on community rather than it's to provide a service to the community rather than it being closed for very long times for training purposes. Now, I know that sort of thing is needed, but it should still have places open for the community and for people to use even whilst that is happening.
Thank you, Councillor Connoly. I'm afraid, folks, we've kind of reached the end. I know there's loads of questions you put in there, and I'm sure the councillors saw the questions. They were reading the comments, and it's something that we should be doing on the lead up to the council elections, is to be in touch with all the candidates from all the parties in your own area, from your own individual local campaigns, as well as from our central campaign of Glasgow Against Closure, and as individuals to be asking questions of them, because the council elections are important. It's something we've stressed with Glasgow Against Closures for a long time, that the accountability of the venues and the services is crucial, and holding our council and our councillors to account is something we don't get a real chance to do often, but you have a chance to do it once every 5 years, and we have a chance over the next month. So make sure you continue the questions. Make sure you join us here every week where we form our campaigns and our strategy, and make sure you join us on the 23rd of April down at Glasgow Green, where we'll come together to make a big, lovely, colourful noise before the council elections. If I could thank Councillor Connoly, Councillor Cunning and Councillor Molyneux for attending. It's a pity we didn't have the ruling party, the ruling group represented here, but I'm sure we got very interesting answers anyway, and I'm sure we've how do I say this diplomatically? We've kind of heard what they've got to say anyway over the last year and a half. So I think we know what most of their answers to the questions would be anyway. So thank you all for coming along. Thank you to the councillors. Thanks to Iona for collating the questions, and thanks for your behaviour so that we didn't have to implement Fatima as our bouncers. So see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.
Well, Chair Jim, see you soon.